Sharīʿah creep. Just testing, see if it works. I'm so happy I got to say that. Thank you. You set it up, though. Welcome. Thank you. Really excited to be here sharing this story. So that is Napoleon in Egypt, which I will come to shortly. But how did I get into this whole idea? Well, so I grew up not practicing Islam. And what was I doing?
DJ.
Yes. I was a very committed DJ in Orange County.
And Queens.
Yes, and I would fly around the US and stuff. But then 9/11 happened, right? And all my DJ friends were like, hey, what's going on? What's your religion all about? And I could not explain anything to them. I didn't know what to say. Actually, I was confronted with ignorance. I had nothing to say. And if you watch Fox News, back then every channel was Fox News. And they were demonizing Islam, and there was a lot of rhetoric about Muslims don't have any room in America. And so I felt this tension that I couldn't be modern, living in a liberal democracy in America at the same time as I was holding on to this tradition that started 1,400 years ago. And so I always had this tension in me. Because I felt comfortable being Muslims in America, but the media was telling me I couldn't hold both at the same time. But that led me, after I did my undergrad, I went to Damascus to go and study, because I think I also believed in the binary, that I couldn't be modern and I had to escape. Of course, I couldn't go study Islam in a Western academy. So I went to Damascus, and then I went to Azhar University, which is like the premier seminary in Cairo, for 8 years. And I studied there. And I was still just obsessed with this question, is how do traditions continue and adapt, but nevertheless remain authoritatively grounded in that divine moment when they started? And so after I did my PhD, after I did my overseas training, I enrolled in a PhD here at USC, and I found it very fruitful. Like, I mastered the Islamic tradition. I spent 8 years there, like I said, sitting on the ground with teachers, going line by line through texts. And then I did my PhD here, and they taught me something very different. You're more attuned to context, and you're analyzing the text rather than summarizing the text, which is what we learned overseas. But once I had a good grounding, I was able to speak both worlds as a first language, I found this amazing productivity in bringing these two worlds together. And at first blush, everyone tells you they're antithetical. The Islamic seminary training and the Western academic training, they can't mix. But I feel that if you enter both as a first language, you're able to put these in productive dialogue and bring them forward in a way that is true to both sides of the Western tradition and the Islamic tradition. And that's what I'm going to share today as I go through this. And so again, I'm always interested in understanding how these traditions change and exist in completely different eras and time and places that Muhammad, clearly, the Quran does not deal with. Once I entered the academy, I found this really fascinating piece of the puzzle. Christine Hayes, Yale, she has a book called What's Divine About Divine Law? And she says, in the Western society, we've inherited two competing notions of what divine law means. The first one is the Greco-Hellenistic notion, which is that law is static. It conforms, divine law is static, it conforms to reason, right? And it has to be applied top down. It doesn't care about human flourishing, and it's very authoritarian. Whereas the biblical model, she shows, the law is grounded in the will of the lawgiver, God, who can change the law whenever he wills. And therefore, the divinity of the rabbinic model, she highlights, is in its ability to be flexible and accommodate the changing needs of Jewish society, whereas the divinity of the Greco model is that it's static. All right? And once I had this cognitive understanding, I saw it everywhere. Okay? Immediately, I went looking back in my textbooks of Islamic law. Noel Colson, this is in a book on Islamic law, Islamic legal studies. In the beginning, he's like, I want to set you up. You got to remember that all divine law divine law is an inflexible, unchanging system with norms of eternal validity. The reason I have these billiard balls is there because he has this understanding that divine law in Islam is a ball, like a bowling ball that enters into society regardless of the economic or political or social structure. The divine law will shatter it and force its way into it in a very authoritarian way. And I did not feel like my studies overseas represented that version of divine law. It was more of the biblical notion. And so I wanted to understand, again, how could I use some of the theorists in the West to help me understand this question of how traditions change. And I found a lot of usefulness in three individuals. Gadamer first, in his book, Truth and Method, he first starts pushing back on the Enlightenment, talking about the Enlightenment was biased against tradition, but it's not until Alistair MacIntyre, who really theorizes tradition as an ongoing argument that extends through time, and when it faces a crisis, it has this ability to adapt itself. And then Talal Asad takes MacIntyre and applies it to the Islamic tradition. So he comes up with the definition of the Islamic tradition is based upon the Quran, the book that was revealed to Muhammad, and his practice and his hadith, which are his sayings, and commentaries by scholars who come generations afterwards commenting on that, extending those arguments throughout time. And now Talal Asad gave us a great definition, but I felt like it was very general and broad, and I wanted to come up with a thicker description of what the Islamic tradition was. And I do that by focusing on Islamic law. So this is the person that I study. His name is Ibn ʿＡbidīn, and he's part of a tradition, a legal tradition called the Ḥanafī school. So what the Ḥanafī school is, he died in 1836, right? Like 200 years ago. This school started over 1,000 years ago. Abu Hanifa was one of the grand students of Muhammad. So Muhammad had students. They spread out. Some went to Iraq, some went to Damascus, some stayed in Saudi Arabia and Medina, and then they had students. And Abu Hanifa is from those students in Iraq. So he's connected to those first generations, and he was a really good legal theorist, and he had students who documented his opinions. But I was surprised that this guy is considered the premier Hanafi authority of the last century. And so what happens in not the last century, of basically the last true classical scholar that existed in the Hanafi school. Why? Because the entire system fell apart. This is when he lived. He lived at a time when the Ottoman Empire was imploding. Greece, Hungary, they all declare their independence. A new idea of nationalism pops up. So it's shifting from imperialism to nation states. And also, power shifts from Istanbul to Western Europe. They have this new idea of joint stock corporations. Capitalism just emerges, and they're able to ship all their goods to the Middle East through industrialized capitalism and bankrupt the entire Middle East, sending all of their wealth and their goods towards Western Europe. And so while the system is imploding, Ibn ʿAbidīn is writing. And he's like, how do we salvage the ship? Or do we hold on to the past, or do we have to come up with new ideas that'll help us move the tradition forward? And so he has this in 1826, he writes what I think is fascinating, the first independent essay on custom. It took 1,000 years for historians and authors of Islam to write an independent tract on just custom. And it makes sense because they're living in an agrarian economy and they're living in an empire, and it doesn't shift until his period. So when you have these rapid political and economic shifts, you're going to have to understand how continuity works despite the changing material conditions. And so him writing this, I focused on this essay in my dissertation, and I tease out an internal theory of how the tradition reforms and rejuvenates itself in every single generation, which I'll lay out with today. Okay, so in his time, he's dealing with these people. They're scholars of the tradition, but they have this idea, and he's complaining that they think the tradition is perfected as it is, and all they have to do in their time is copy and paste. And so he gives an opinion, about an endowment case, and his contemporaries reject it. They're like, we're not going to follow you when the books say something else. And this happens to him time and time again. And he tells them, look, the books were written in certain times and certain places, and they're actually prone to errors. He's able to trace out how the error might have happened 6 centuries ago, and then all 20 books afterwards copy that error. So he's interested in tracing errors and also showing that we have to think through, there has to be a new approach. And I'm going to highlight some of the theoretical ideas he has to deal with, which is to show that the tradition is not perfected in the past. I call it critical traditionalism. And the only way that this is going to survive is that the jurists independently in every single generation decide what parts of the tradition are going to move forward and what parts are going to stay the same. And he comes up with a model that I'll share with you in a second. But here's him railing against his contemporaries, rigidly applying inherited rulings while ignoring context and people's lived realities leads to injustice and the loss of rights. So that word he used, rigidly, it's an Arabic word called jumud. It literally means static. Copying and pasting what existed before without amending it will lead to disastrous consequences. And so I inferred from that, if it's not supposed to be static, it seems like the tradition must have this ability to flow. Despite material conditions, it should be able to adjust and flow throughout time in order for it to be continuous. Another idea, like I said, his contemporaries thought the tradition was perfected because the people who were before, closer to Muhammad, they must be better and closer to the truth than we are. And he highlights that if God's agency exists and his power in every single generation, then it's possible that God could give insights to later scholars that the earlier scholars didn't have. And he says, he actually goes into a book of humanities. There's a poet he's quoting from, Mubarrad, who says that every single ancient, at one time he was modern in his time before he became ancient, and every single modern, ultimately with the passage of time, they're going to be ancient. So there's nothing, time is relative when it comes to tradition, and we should look at opinions based on the substance and the argument. And that there's this other, a hadith from Muhammad he brings up where that there will be a group on the truth until the end of time. And he extrapolates that there always will need to be a group of people who are constantly adjudicating the tradition, making sure it works well for society in every single generation. And he, declares he thinks he's part of it. But it's interesting because in the beginning, I thought he was being arrogant when he said crazy things like, everyone who is in this tradition needs to read my book. I've reached conclusions that I've never found in any other book. And therefore, this is indispensable. At first blush, I'm like, who is this arrogant dude, right? But then afterwards, he grounds it in this presence that God exists and God's power exists just as it existed back then. So he's actually just declaring, I've been able to come up with solutions that work for my time because of the presence of God in this generation and in previous generations. There's a type of relativity to time as it unfolds, and that everyone, no matter what generation you're in, you have to contribute to it. Okay, so now I'm going to, I've looked at numerous case studies, and then I put together and extrapolate this idea that I think is latent in his thought. So the Islamic legal tradition starts with 1400 years ago with Muhammad. The Quran and the Hadith, his sayings, become the corpus, the founding documents. But what we have then is scholars commenting generation and generation afterwards in these commentaries. And now this becomes an ongoing conversation as the next generation, like the fellow Ibn ʿＡbidīn that I'm working on, he writes a commentary commenting on someone who lived 400 years before him, who's commenting on someone who's commenting all the way back to the beginning. And so this tradition keeps going. However, he comes up, I come up with this, I think I'm arguing that this is latent in his thought. I feel like jumping over here, but so I call it the sacred balance, and there's an intercontextual component here. What does intercontext mean? That depending on what we're talking about, there's different rules of engagement. So if we're talking about belief in God and worship, the 5 prayers that Muslims do, Muslims go to pilgrimage in Mecca, Muslims fast in Ramadan, those are stable, and that's why there's a solid line around this. Meaning that lived reality, social norms, economic pressures cannot cancel out these rulings. You might get an exception, but the rule still stands. But when it comes to socioeconomic issues, you see it's perforated here, where he allows customs and norms and lived reality to have an influence, especially in this context in which the Ottomans are going bankrupt, right? There's new contracts that emerge coming from the West, like insurance. And he actually says, I'm the first, he says there's this, he uses the Italian term, securata, security, and it's Arabicized, secura. And he says, I've looked in every single book, I've never seen anyone talk about this thing, and I think I'm the first to deal with this issue of insurance. And so clearly that outside contract or idea is coming into his realm where he's going to have to deal with it. And then the political realm is outside, because in order for people's livelihood and buying and selling that has to be stabilized so that they can worship properly. The political order has to be stable. And so the more we move outward, the less the Quran and Hadith, direct things from Muhammad and in the Quran, are going to have to say here. Meaning that worship is going to be dictated directly by the Quran, even less so here in the socioeconomic. But when you get out here, there's not much. You follow general principles of what's in the best welfare for society, what will stabilize society. And so I call this, well, Professor Jackson calls it the Islamic secular. And the reason I'm using it not in the Enlightenment binary of religion and secular bumping into each other. Here, Islam encompasses a secular component in that the jurists have to adjudicate issues in the political and socioeconomic realm, but they're not going to look to the Quran and the founding texts of Islam to come up with these solutions. They're going to look at lived practice and social and empirical evidence on the ground. And so what he's highlighting is that there has to be this calibration in every single generation. This is stable, the middle part, but the contracts have to be adjudicated, and the political realm. He does allow at certain points, if the state is not allowing you to practice your religion at this realm, or if they're causing economic chaos, he allows for rebellion and overturning the state. However, he wants to know what's in the best welfare of the community, the Muslim community. And so what that does is then take me to this picture here. So this is the Sharia, the Islamic legal tradition. Inside the core is the things that are non-negotiable: belief in God, day judgment, moral responsibility, the 5 pillars, which are like praying and fasting and pilgrimage. But as you can see, ideas, concepts that exist in these other discourses can be brought in. And Ibn ʿＡbidīn, the author I'm looking at, he is actively bringing in like that idea of every person who was ancient will be modern, and every person who was modern was ancient. That comes from a poem of Mubarrad, and he brings it in here to explain how the Sharia unfolds. And I have examples from each of these realms in my dissertation. But what this tells me then is this is all Islam, right? And concern for the economy and for politics are Islamic, but it doesn't dictate what the political structure or economic structure should be. And so the fact that he's advocating Islam should be able to continue through the shift from agrarian economy to industrialized capitalism, from empire to nation state, shows that the tradition doesn't have a predisposed economic or political structure, and there's other considerations that are looked at for continuity. And this is the interdisciplinary aspect, because some people have argued that Sharia is completely cut off from these other sources of meaning. But I don't think that that might be a more recent phenomenon, but nevertheless, in the 1800s, it was completely integrated with other disciplines of society. And now, a commentator on Ibn ʿAbidīn, the foremost actually commentator on Islamic law, Wa'il Halaq at Columbia, he says that Ibn Abidin suffers from epistemic schizophrenia, and he's torn between the divine decree, following the tradition, the archive, and humanistic considerations. And I think that the tension is more in the analyst's head, because Ibn Abidin seems to have it resolved, in that when he's arguing that we have to, as jurists, have to tend to human conditions and political considerations, he comes up with, he pulls from the tradition, he pulls from the Quran, he pulls from the Hadith, he pulls from all this precedent, and so he's citing every single one of his moves to show that it's in continuity with the tradition, it's not a rupture. And nevertheless, Ibn Abidin argues that it's a duty not to, what I just call copy and paste, but to re-adjudicate and make sure that what you're highlighting from the tradition is guarantees the tradition's survival. Alistair McIntyre says that if the tradition doesn't do this, it dies, right? And so Ibn Abidin, in the same way, is highlighting it will lead to injustice, and people will just abandon the tradition because it'll be too difficult for them to adhere to. And so Islamic orthodoxy, in Islam, we don't have the magisterium. Orthodoxy, I wrote with a lower o there, lowercase o, because there is an idea of orthodoxy, but it's communal. And so Ibn Abidin saying we jurists have to renegotiate what is orthodox, not in terms of belief, because I said like the beliefs and those core ways of worshiping God through prayer, those don't change. However, what the economic situation and political situation, those have to be renegotiated to establish a new orthodoxy in those realms in every single generation. And concluding, so if I'm zooming out from Islamic law now, and I just want to, Talal Asad said that Islamic tradition is a discursive tradition, a discourse happening along the in the commentaries on the Quran and the Hadith that extend for generations. I'm trying to go a step further by arguing what are some of the mechanisms that allow for structural change while maintaining continuity. And I think the sacred balance helps me do that by isolating those parts that are non-negotiable and then those parts that are negotiable. And so I tried to provide a richer account, a thicker description of what tradition is using this idea of the sacred balance. But why this matters today? Well, Muslims are continually trying to negotiate the role of politics, the role of new economic practices in their society, and having this historically grounded, I show in my dissertation how it goes back, it's latent in the text. This is a model that they can use to help adjudicate and negotiate some of these realities that Muslims find themselves in. And lastly, just to highlight, the sacred balance allows for continuity without stagnation, authority because it's ultimately going back to the founder Abu Hanifa, who was from the great grand students of Muhammad, and adaptation without rupture, where Ibn Abidin is highlighting that human flourishing is part of the Islamic tradition, and that yes, there's things that we have to do without question when we worship God and believe in Him, but those other realms, when it comes to socioeconomic and political, there's more room for human flourishing. And lastly, so in the upshot here, I don't think I would have been able to do this dissertation had I not studied overseas and been so aware of what the arguments that were happening in those commentaries and commentaries of commentaries, and to see those internal mechanisms and be able to, we study texts over there very closely, right? And I think that really helped. But bringing in these theorists like McIntyre and Gadamer and Heidegger really then helped me understand some of the, they were already trying to rehabilitate tradition post-Kant. And bringing these two worlds together, I thought, was very fruitful. And I found in the classroom, I talked to the students today about it, they were so interested in the amalgamation, because at first blush, it does seem like these worlds don't mix. But having, McIntyre says, someone who speaks both as a first language can show how they can be brought together. And the wholes, Islam can learn from the Western tradition, and vice versa. The Western academy can maybe learn from the Islamic tradition. And there is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Up to an hour for conversation, question, and dialogue. So if ever you can take your own questions.
Yeah.
I guess, how did you feel when you came back from Damascus? Like, were you kind of like culture shocked going there, and then also when you came back? 'Cause
Yes.
I don't know when you went, but I'm sure.
2007, absolutely. Complete culture shock. Damascus, Soccer can tell you, just everything is so different there. It was, I like living in a liberal democracy. Paved roads are nice, schedules are nice. But I really felt like I had to suffer through all that just so I could get authentic knowledge. I had this really skewed understanding of where authentic Islam was, and I thought it was overseas, right? But when I came back, yeah, I was in like a culture shock also. I also had reverse culture shock by coming here because I mean, it was really good, like having my subjectivity completely cut off for 8 years from Western society, but immersing myself in that tradition in the seminary. But then when I came back, I had to relearn what it meant to be American. But nevertheless, I think I gained a new insight. Things that I took for granted, I was able to see, well, that doesn't need to be that way, Well, where does this come from? Oh, this might be just an Enlightenment hang-up where it doesn't, we can see it another way now, So I think there was benefit to the dialectic going back and forth between these two worlds. And I would come home often, and I know that coming back and forth, I think, was productive in that my subjectivity is refracted between both worlds at the whole time I'm going there. Okay. Yeah.
So you kind of give us a rundown in class today of like kind of the subjects you were talking about, and it's less of a question, more of a comment on like I'm a transfer student, so I took a Islamic secularism class at UC Santa Barbara with Professor Ahmed, and he actually had us read Sherman Jackson's book, and I think like the work you're doing and that class and like the presentation really just shifted my perspective on what it means to live like be a Muslim and live your life. And I think like when you talk about the Islamic secularism, it's these core values that are never changing that then emanate out into everyday practices and like the jurist rulings. So I think the class really changed my life, and Sherman Jackson is like amazing, and I see a lot of like what Sherman's work and like Sherman's attitude and like teaching style in you. And so I think like the class, if that could be brought here, would be like perfect. So, yeah.
Sign me up. I'll do it. Yes, I'm going to share that with Dr. Jackson. I appreciate that. He came to your class, right, to Santa Barbara?
Yeah, he came to our class, and I think that whole like quarter that I had that class with Professor Ahmad, if you know anything about him, he's a little bit more intense. So his teaching style is very different than Sherman. So Sherman came in and was like a breath of fresh, like he was like all bubbly and excited, and like it was just amazing. And I think how he explained this Islamic secularism was just so different than just reading it in his book. And yeah, I think I grew up with a Catholic mom and a Muslim dad, and so I really do have like an investment in learning more about like religions and how they tie together. So learning about the Islamic secularism and seeing how like my culture as a Palestinian has tied into being what being Muslim has meant as a child. That class was like, and his book was a cherry on top of like wrapping everything together. So.
Thank you. Amazing. So in honor of Dr. Jackson, I'm just going to make one comment. Secularism, which Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmood highlight, is almost, it is antithetical to religion because it is trying to discipline people into a secular way of life. So Jackson's not, he's not advocating for secularism, he's advocating for the Islamic secular. Secularism seems to be a whole worldview that you buy into from the Enlightenment. You think Kant, and whereas Jackson's highlighting the Islamic secular is still in the adjudicative gaze of God, but there's no specific instruction coming from the Quran or Hadith, and we can look to the world to enlighten us about what to do. So just to flesh out secularism versus the secular. All right, thanks. Question in the back. Now come up here.
Having studied this sacred balance and Islamic secular, do you feel that either like certain places or maybe how certain nation states function today maybe subscribe either more to Islamic tradition or Western modernism or vice versa?
Sorry, can you just say a little louder? Just the end drifted off. My bad.
Do you feel that either certain places or functioning modern nation states either subscribe more to Islamic tradition or Western modernism or vice versa?
So, I like a part of my dissertation. Great question, actually, excellent question. And Talal Asad says that tradition and modernity are talking about two aspects of social life, and they're not necessarily in contradiction. Kant, in his What is Enlightenment, he makes us want to think they're in contradiction. But I'm really hesitant to apply something I developed that worked in the 1800s to nation states. But so what I'm trying to highlight, I feel like there are aspects of modernity that are not pernicious to religion, and that tradition can actually accommodate. And so the way you pitted some being Islamic traditional versus modern, I would say that they can be both at the same time according to this model. And it's just up to the scholars to decide what concepts, contracts, and ideas they would like to incorporate into the tradition. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for
Thanks.
the presentation. My question is about the relationship between rupture and continuity in tradition. You mentioned Heidegger right at the end, and one of Heidegger's ideas about tradition is that they're constituted as much by moments of rupture, destruction is his preferred word, destruere in the sense of unbuilding. You have to unbuild aspects of the tradition that sometimes become calcified and obscure,
Yes.
maybe these more primordial elements. So is there this idea, as you've developed this philosophy of Islamic tradition, is there an account also of destruction, of rupture, as something that's necessary?
Yes. And going back to McIntyre, he calls it crisis. It falls into epistemological crisis. And unless the adherents of the tradition come up with ideas that can explain why they fell into crisis in the first place, and then explain how on their own terms that the tradition can overcome it, they will die. And so what I was talking about with Ibn ʿAbidīn, exactly, that he was highlighting, look, there's going to be a massive rupture unless we rethink how to move the tradition forward. And so I think there are moments of crisis where destruction and rupture are about to happen, and unless the tradition and the adherents of the tradition who are arguing come up with a way to resolve it, even looking outside their tradition to bring in ideas, the tradition will rupture and die. And so I do have that latent in there, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
I just feel like maybe you've seen this because you've been a part of the Islamic world for a while. Do you feel like maybe the negative portrayal of Islam in like the West has kind of brought people more to it? Because I know in my culture, like a lot of Latin people are converting to Islam, and like my brother is also part of that.
Yeah.
And I think that like because in America, especially, we see Islam as like an enemy in a sense. But once you actually discover and take a class, you see it in a whole different light, and it becomes something more interesting. Like you feel, like you're deflecting away from the norm. Just learning about this different culture that we're taught is completely different from what it is.
I think so. I don't have to, I'll let some of the other professors answer, but also just the bad publicity is still publicity. and yes, it like people care. I mean, I remember when Islam, after 9/11, the number of jobs for Islamic studies scholars shot up, okay? And then when Russia became bad in the last like 5 years, Islamic studies the jobs tanked. And now I'm, with Iran and Palestine, I'm thinking like there probably would be more jobs. But what do the jobs signify? They signify that people care about this and have questions and want to talk about it. One of the other Islamic studies professors could help out with that question too.
On that, part of that was also, of the lacuna. You have this kind of thing, oh, there's X million Muslims in the US, maybe we need to have someone, there's X million Muslims like living in New York, maybe we should have someone that understands this. But so there's a couple of things there. One was when you were talking at the beginning, it made me think of my teacher, Wilfred Campbell Smith, and I give my students in the comparative theology class his Patterns of Faith Around the World book, because just in passing, and that's Wilfred's genius, like this is literally like a passing comment. He says, isn't it kind of interesting that in the West, we have these two systems. Our politics and our laws are Greco-Roman. Literally the words, like democracy, all that kind of stuff. Our religious traditions are Near Eastern. He uses the term Palestinian in a really interesting kind of way. That, you know, most of us in America are either, and I'm saying someone's not, either Christian or Jewish, you know, but our legal tradition is Roman. And so the idea that, you know, we can see our laws and our politics as separate from, divorced from our religious, because that's what they are.
Yeah.
And the passing comment is, yeah, in the case of Islam and India and China, it's not so simple. You know, what do you do when those things are fused together? So the one part. The other part, it made me think, you know, and again, one of the nice things about being old is, you know, having sat with Michael Marmura, a phenomenal scholar of Islamic philosophy, to read Shafi's Risala, you know, one of the first texts, perhaps the first text in law. And Shafi is trying to, exactly what you just said with Ibn Abidin, doing this, like, what are we doing here? Is this the law because this is what we do? Even though I know in Kufa they do this. You know, and wrestling with exactly that sense of context. You know, what is local custom? You know, what is authoritative for everyone? It gets really interesting.
And that's why Ibn Abidin, at the end of the day, doesn't end up being that special. He's just a normal jurist who does what he's supposed to do in every single generation. We have the assumption that they're not innovative people, and so when you look at him, he looks like he's outside of the box, but he seems to be pretty standard Ḥanafī.
And it's having folks like you, or having, I mean, you were at Azhar. Last time I was at Azhar was 2009, and spent some time with Ahmed Tayyib. You know, before he became this was when Sheikh Tantawi was still the Sheikh of Azhar, and after his death, Ahmed Tayyib. And you look at Ahmed, whose PhD is in the West, in, you know, really interesting kinds of things. I think that's the thing that sort of, and that dichotomy of Islam in the West is a ridiculous one, because would the West be the West without Muslim contributions to what it means, including like Arabic numbers, you know, just those sorts of things. Really fascinating conversations.
And that's why, like, you know, I could have finished my PhD in 5 years if I stacked my committee with a bunch of Muslims, but I chose Albertson Catholicism, and I chose Jessica Margolin, chair of Jewish studies, because I wanted to, like Ahmed Tayyib, just be able to speak beyond my own tradition and to see how there's so much actually common between these traditions vis-a-vis the Enlightenment. And I benefited tremendously from MacIntyre. As I don't know, if you read my dissertation, you'll see every other footnote is from him, more than Talal Asad. Because Asad, he's an anthropologist. He's not a scholar, though. He's not a scholar of Islam. And the way that MacIntyre brings in Aquinas and shows how Aquinas wrestles between Aristotelianism and Latin Averroism, enters into both as a first language and reconciles them. When I was reading that, I could just see Ibn Abidin doing the same thing, and so I piggybacked a lot off the Catholic tradition, MacIntyre. And so yeah, that model, I think Azhar is interesting because it kind of like promotes that kind of model, you know. Thanks. I think, wait, there was a tie, so I'll go back.
I will gladly take seconds.
Go ahead, Sakib.
Thanks so much for this. So in your diagram of the sacred balance,
Yeah.
where you had, I think, faith as sort of an unchanging core
Yeah.
in the middle, and then as you sort of radiate out, there's more permeability
Yes.
and sort of acceptance of custom and local practice and need for change.
Right.
So, you know, how would you think about, it's something I think maybe spoken about before, but how do you think about, you know, those social practices that the Quran is directly commenting on, right? So where the Quran is giving guidance on how marriage is supposed to work and how inheritance is supposed to work. That's not faith and ritual anymore.
No.
That is in the social sphere.
Right.
But yet, if we're going to say that the social sphere needs to be open to change and to reinterpretation and to flourishing,
Yeah.
then how would someone like Ibn Abidin think about, what is the extent and limit of that change, and can it even go beyond what the rules the Quran itself says?
So excellent, thank you. The reason that it's this, so marriage and divorce and business transactions would be in here. This is how it's classified in the Islamic tradition that he's working with. And the reason it's closest to here is because the Quran and Hadith both have a lot to say. The jurists feel that there are norms in marriage and in the economic realm that they can't change. Like, certain contracts Muhammad prohibited, and they won't be able to overturn them. And that's why over here there's more flexibility, and he's explicit about this. But so he would, those explicit pronouncements in the Quran, he would, I think the default would be to adhere to them. But in one case, he says that, well, Muhammad was just the reason Muhammad said that is because that was the custom of contracts in Medina at the time. So he did, and that was the first time I've ever seen anyone. Afterwards, people do it all the time, like modern scholars. But to say that, to contextualize Muhammad, first he says that the founding jurist, Abu Hanifa, many of the rulings he said were contextual to Kufa. And the same thing with Muhammad in this one case of buying and selling. And so for the most part, it looks like he would defer to explicit pronouncements in the Quran and Hadith, unless there's this overwhelming social need, which in his time, that contract it was hurting the Ottoman ability to debase the currency and raise funds. So he had to contextualize Muhammad to ask what was the underlying goal that Muhammad was trying to shoot for here, and not sticking to the letter of the law, but the spirit. And so I think every single case has to be adjudicated by the needs, the economic needs at that time. But he does seem to be open if there's a necessity or an overwhelming reason for public welfare to overturn some of the things that are inherited, even if they're in the Quran. Yeah. Thank you.
That is part of a broader tradition, like the idea of maslahah.
Exactly.
So he's not
That's why.
completely.
No, he's nothing. He's a standard run-of-the-mill jurist. There's nothing new about him. Is what's shocking, And like I just find it interesting. Time is interesting because the empire is falling apart, it's shifting. The economic structure is shifting and the political structure is shifting. So any ruptures we do perceive in his thought have to do about ruptures in the material conditions that he's living in, rather than this continuity. He has a citation for every move he makes. And so, yeah, absolutely. Maslahah is the term that they would use. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me handle that one right there. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
As a Catholic theologian, it's always fun to hear people reflect on the relationship between tradition and modernity from a different perspective, and a complicated one. So this may be like a Western Christian obsession, so I apologize in advance if it is. But it seems to me in what you're saying, there's a certain kind of complex relationship between divine agency and human agency. Is that true? And maybe if you could say more about that?
Yeah.
Or just tell me if I'm off.
No, absolutely. So what defines this realm here is, and this is not just Ibn Abidin, this is going back 1,000 years of scholarship. These, what they call it, rights or duties owed to God. And these duties owed to God are praying, fasting, going to pilgrimage, and basic beliefs about God, Day of Judgment, monotheism, moral responsibility. So those are considered like rights owed to God, and this goes right back to Abu Hanifa, who I said is in the beginning of that tradition 1,000 years ago. Whereas here, the goal here is to establish rights you owe to other individuals, and so although it's part of Islamic law. It's part of Islamic law because you have a duty to not cheat this person and to come up with an equitable solution in your business transactions. But God, it's not directly a duty to God. It's a duty to humans. But after the fact, a consequence of which it's a right to God you have to hold, because God wants you to deal with people fairly. So they delineate, yeah, this circle is duties to God, and this is duties to other humans. This would be like a duty to the public sphere. Yes. Thank you. That was a great question. Yes, Julian.
Does this framework work for someone who lives outside of society?
Oops.
Or maybe like outside of what we consider like modern society?
What do you mean?
So like maybe like they don't necessarily live with like in like within a structure where they have like politics necessarily,
Yeah.
but more so they're like living off the land
Well,
communally, something like that.
you remember we talked about this in our class, which was that it seems to be that there's two understandings of anthropology, of what it means to be a human. Number one is John Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, where they came up with this idea that humans were in a state of nature and there was no authority, no governance, and they consented to it, right? Whereas the Aristotelian model, the zoon politikon, humans are born in the polis with relationships to the city, to their family, and they cannot, once they're 18, they can't just check out of them. And it seems like the Islamic model adopted that one. And so McIntyre says that the Catholic model adopted this one too, and Maimonides. So I would say, like, David Hume criticized this whole state of nature, to think that we exist in some state that doesn't have any political or social structure is a figment of Locke's imagination. But now it's not, because so you're talking about off the grid. They're still in America though, right? And so, anyways, this is for the jurists, not for those people. This is for the Islamic jurist who's trying to figure out, how do I establish continuity and be in conversation with the discussions that came beforehand, but accommodate these new lived realities here. And I think the assumption is that people are in social relations with wives, parents, business partners, and they're in some type of political structure. So I think it would be the latter. Thank you, Julian. All right. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This is so interesting, and I also, as a Catholic, am fascinated because we have lots of our own issues with tradition. So with the non-negotiables that you talk about, is there disagreement on what constitutes them or how to interpret them? And is there a challenge with creeping non-negotiables?
Absolutely, 100%, yes. And that's why, like, I drew this as a solid line, but it's a little fuzzy. But I think there is an agreement about, there's a difference. Everyone agrees that Muslims have to pray 5 times a day. How that looks on the ground differs, right? So the substantive idea at the general level they agree upon, but then the particulars seem to change. So I do think there is enough to unify, to have some agreement on what the fundamentals are. And no matter where you're at, you'll find Muslims praying. It generally looks the same. And they get together in Mecca and they're doing the pilgrimage. At a general level, from the outsider's point of view, it looks pretty similar. And so therefore, yes, there is a little bit of disagreement, I think, when you get into the weeds and the practice of it. But in terms of like the general idea of believing in monotheism, Day of Judgment, revelation, that Muhammad was a prophet, these things they all agree upon. But once you start engaging them in a longer discussion, differences start to arise. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks so much for
Thanks.
this. I'm thinking about the sacred balance, and you talked about like the Ḥanafī school, how they approach it, Ibn ʿＡbidīn belonging to the Ḥanafī school. But I'm curious, with some modern Muslim groups like Salafis, would they follow kind of this approach, or because they're going back more to the fundamentals, are the lines even more blurred than this diagram?
Absolutely, yes. So after Ibn Abidin, and Muslims were trying to figure out, if we have an ascendant civilization, what the hell happened to us? How did the French, Italians, and British overnight colonize us? What happened here? So you have people starting to point fingers that the tradition screwed us. The Ottomans screwed us. We got to get rid of them. And this whole Ḥanafī tradition of these commentaries that have been happening for 1,000 years, that was the reason we fell into this trap to begin with. We got to go back to the beginning to figure this thing all out. And so, yes, I think they would. I think they would agree on these categories. They would just place them in different areas. Well, hold on, let me think about that. He's asking a question about Salafis who originate in about the 1850s after the onslaught of colonialism, and they're trying to figure out how do we get into this problem here. And I think that so Salafis is a difficult word because you have people like Rashid Ridha on one side, and then you have people in Saudi Arabia who are very different. And so when you're saying Salafi, you mean more people who are looking at it literally and less room for negotiation, I guess?
Yeah, I think probably more on the Saudi side.
Yeah, okay.
You know, the way Azhar will teach one thing.
Yeah.
The way you're going to be taught in like Medina is going to be another thing. Are they going to be looking at Ibn ʿAbidīn in Medina?
No, because they would say that the tradition, Ibn ʿAbidīn is part of the problem.
Yeah.
He got us into this mess to begin with. Yeah. And we need to go back further to the sources in the beginning and follow Muhammad verbatim. Yeah, I think, I really feel guilty for just kind of like, I want to just quickly say that. I know it's more nuanced than that, but yes, basically, yes, that's part of the issue. You have something, Sakib, you want to add something?
No.
About that? Oh, okay.
No, I just as a quick answer. That's it.
What was your quick answer?
No, I mean, as the quick answer you gave.
Yeah. I don't want to be reductionist, you know?
No, but it's also like the tensions here. So Keisha Ali, who's at Boston University, has brought together a couple of us, including Saki and myself, people who do like Islamic studies programs in the U.S. And so we have this great new program here that Saki is doing. And one of the questions is like, well, what are the requirements? What do you do? Like, is there a language? And that debate about, well, do you need to have Arabic? And you can see where I'm going with this is that, yeah, Islam begins in the Arab world. The Quran is revealed to people who speak Arabic. And so you have that. But then very quickly it expands and goes out. And the majority of Muslims don't speak Arabic.
Right.
Where does this come in? What happens? So when Wilfred Cantwell Smith, in 1940, once learned about Islam, for him it's a no-brainer. In 1940 in Canada, there's maybe 5,000 Muslims. Let me go to the country with the most Muslims. 1940, that's
India. Yes.
He goes to India. Why? Because he wants to live with Muslims. And it wasn't about, let me go to the Arab world, let me go here.
Right.
Even though he'd already been, his family's wealthy, he'd done the grand tour where they'd gone to Egypt and Palestine and that sort of stuff. For him, it was India. And so there's really interesting kinds of questions, like where is authority? Where does that come in? And do you always go back to this particular model?
Right.
It's a fascinating question.
And just building off that, so the idea of where is authority? This is still quite a juristic model that you
Yes.
take about. So the medieval Muslim philosophers,
Yes.
if they were to build this model, yeah,
Yes.
exactly, it would look much more like this because, right? I mean, for them, what you're presenting as the unshakable core, yes.
Oh, yes.
That would maybe be smaller.
Smaller.
Or
Yes.
It would be certainly more open to outside influence because they would say, well, yeah, we have to think about rational inquiry and how
Yes.
that helps us understand the core tenets.
Yes. And this is exactly what Aquinas, when the Latin Averroists, Ibn Rushd Averroes, and his ideas started coming into the purview of Aquinas, the issue was that the philosophers of Islam felt that the Quran was speaking to the layman. It's not speaking to us philosophers because we have intellects. We can figure it out. Yes, exactly. We can figure it out ourselves. And so Aquinas was said, if this whole double revelation thing, one for the masses and one for the elites, permeates into Catholicism, it's going to be a problem. So that's what McIntyre shows how he dealt with it. But yes, they would shrink this down and say that it's only for the masses, right? Whereas the philosophers, all we have to do is sit and reflect on God, and that's our worship. You know, the greatest thing to contemplate would be God's essence, and that would be the highest form of worship.
And you think Aquinas is explicitly
Ye-
engaging with this?
Yeah, that's exactly because in that book called, is it After Virtue? No, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry by MacIntyre, where he tries to show how different traditions, the Enlightenment tradition and traditionalism of Catholicism, can be brought together, and also he's trying to show how Catholicism and the tradition of Catholicism solves the problems that the Enlightenment brings. And so he goes back to Aquinas' debate and problems that he was dealing with in his time, which is that in the 1100s, Averroes' ideas had spread all over Europe. Ibn Rushd, yeah. And especially, it's the same as Ibn Sina. It's the philosophers, which is that we don't need to follow these rules. This is for the layman, right? These are all parables. We can interpret them metaphorically. Scripture, we don't have to really follow the letter of the law, right? And so those ideas that is where that book is about Aquinas dealing with the influx of Latin Averroism and trying to show that there's not doublespeak. There's one univocular, one speech in Revelation that applies to everyone. And so I don't think, so going back, yes, that idea would not, Ibn ʿＡbidīn would push back on. He wouldn't be interested because that would erode this middle category. For the philosopher, for the layman, it would still hold, right? But here, I do want to highlight that he's open to bringing in ideas from Avicenna and Ibn Rushd into Sharia if it helps the tradition move forward. He does so a lot from theology. I can't remember the example I used in my dissertation right now.
And it's those practical connections. So I'm thinking of one of Tracy's teachers, David Burrell.
Oh, nice.
And so you look at David, as this Holy Cross priest,
Yeah.
who gets sent to Tantur, the Ecumenical Institute of Jerusalem, because Notre Dame is tasked now with running this post-Vatican II, and that's David's first sort of connection to Israelis and Palestinians, and understanding these things and realizing, oh wait, I'm a Catholic priest and a scholar of Aquinas, but if I'm really going to understand Aquinas, I have to know Averroes.
Yes.
I have to know Maimonides, and that comes from the day-to-day interactions
Yeah.
with Jews and Palestinians at Tantur, and having that connection. And so, next month I'm going off. There's a couple of folks at the GTU who realize, oh, we actually haven't done a fesher for David. There's not been a fesher for David Burrell, and so trying to think about, how would we do that kind of thing? What would that look like? And so exactly those sorts of connections I think are so powerful.
Well, going back to your question about the culture shock, when I first came and I enrolled in the PhD at USC, I had no intention with studying with some Catholic philosopher, Albertson. What is he going to teach me about Islam, And literally, on principle, I had no intention of studying with these people outside. But then I ended up studying for 3 years with him, and it was probably, Jackson is great in understanding Islam, but I already had a lot of Islam already to begin with, you know what I mean? And so I also had to unlearn. It's weird, studying over there for so long kind of made me in this mental silo where I just I didn't think I could learn anything from Albertson or Aquinas or MacIntyre or any of these, or Gadamer, But nevertheless, I grew out of it. And I think that's why in the beginning it seems like these two worlds are antithetical and in conflict and in tension. But speaking both as a first language, as MacIntyre says, you can show how they can be brought in like a rapprochement, an equilibrium between them. Yeah.
I had another one. I can't remember who made this argument. There's a book recently published about how Islamic law is to blame for holding Muslim countries back.
Timur Quran.
Yes.
Yes.
So I think his argument is that because of the calcification of the Islamic legal system, they were unable to adapt to these new financial instruments that were being developed.
Yes.
So I guess I have a couple of questions regarding that. So, I mean, first of all, it was the Ottomans who brought the jurists into the state system, right?
Right.
So, had they not done so, do you think the Ottoman state, if it had retained some sort of separation of powers, the way pre-Ottoman kind of polities did, in which the jurists sort of had their domain, but they had very little kind of say in politics, would it have been more nimble in adapting to the financial innovations of Europe? So is it the fact that they brought the jurists in and started taking them seriously in the first place that resulted in them struggling with these new financial instruments and how to accommodate them in the law?
I don't think so. And I'm looking at there's a reviewer of this book named Zuhair Ghazal, and he shows that this idea of Islamic law holding back the Middle East. Firstly, he says he's a historian, and he says that politics, economics, and social practices on the ground, they occur in society, right? And then the legislation happens ex post facto as it already arrives. Like, it's not that Islamic law is dictating what the social and political and economic realm should be. And actually, Ibn ʿＡbidīn shows that he's just reacting to what's already happening on the ground. And so the default is to just to validate the status quo, what's already happening. And so going back to the Ottomans have a very interesting relationship. They do take Hanafism, they take the Hanafi school and make it the official law of their land, right? But I think that's to unify law, as it was happening with the Habsburgs were doing that. It was kind of like the way to do it at the time, to have one legal system for their entire system. But they didn't give the jurists like, I don't, yeah, the jurists were still underneath their thumb to a certain extent, you know. Colin Imber has a book on Abu Saud, and then obviously we get to the later Majalla, and so Mahmud II, who's in Ibn ʿAbidīn's time, they seem to be doing what they feel. There is a division of labor. That's another thing here, that, you know, Ibn ʿAbidīn is kind of working here, and they kind of leave politics to the Ottoman state. And we have our realm, and you have your realm. And what we're called upon to do is just to ratify your economic or political policies. I think what happened was that there was bad economic strategies and policies. One of them was this debasement issue. As the Ottomans needed money to fight these wars that were happening everywhere, especially the ones with Russia, they debased the currency and tried to take gold and silver out of the currency. And they thought that the short-term effects of debasement, they would be able to overcome it, the long-term effects of inflation and stuff. And unfortunately, they weren't able to. The inflation rates went crazy, and the colonizers had to come in to protect their loans under the guise of, hey, we're here to just take care of our economic policies. We have to... And so the thing is, the Ottomans seem to have made bad economic choices and political choices that led to their downfall, I think. And it not necessarily, and like the law was always catching up, basically, you know? Law and politics seems to be, social reality and lived realities are ahead of them. Yeah.
Has there ever been any conversation where empires are even morally right?
Oh, yeah, in the Quran, actually, that's, you know, very good question, because the same author, Zuhair Ghazal, highlights how, like, they had the Abbasids for the first, like, you had the Umayyads and the Abbasids, that's the first 400 years. And then you have this Eastern Turkic Mongolian notion of how the state and empire should be run. And what it is that the military and the state owns everything. And they give lands, it's called prebendalism or patrimonialism, where they give land to their fighters to hold on to. So there's no such thing as what's it called? Private property. There's no private property. The state owns everything, and it becomes, it actually causes a lot of problems that Ibn ʿAbidīn and jurists have to deal with. But it's because this model came from, it's not like Islamic, you know, and it came from Mongolian custom and Turkic warlord custom, in that the state owns everything, and the warriors will get a plot of land. And whenever it's time to fight, you come and you have your peasants take care of the land, but you have to fight for it. And so it was in their interest to take over all land. And then they bring in the religious class to justify their authority. Yeah, that seems very oppressive, I guess, if you look at it.
Like, my main concern is just like, when you talk about the colonizers coming in, it's like people are like, we gotta be like them to survive. And it's like, the main reason why the colonizers were so powerful was because they exploited and enslaved so many people. So.
Yeah, I mean, that system was exploitative too, that they were already dealing with before, which is another reason it probably led to the implosion as well. Yeah.
Well, there were also instances like in Africa where there was I don't know what it's called. It's like people coming in and enforcing Islam upon people. Like, what about that form of colonization where it's bringing Islam somewhere to enforce that religion upon an area, especially like indigenous areas?
I always I heard a lecture, Richard Bullitt at Columbia. He differentiates between colonization and expansion, and so he highlights, like in Egypt, most of the people on the ground would not have known that there was even a change in administration because the Muslims were they wanted to keep the structures and just give me the taxes. Whereas he's highlighting in colonialism, all the institutions are changed. The society is completely restructured to filter into Western Europe. Whereas the expansion model, the Muslims purposely built garrison cities and they lived apart from everyone else. And so I understand that there was an expansion happening, but it seems to be substantively different from what's happening in the colonial era starting in the 1500s. But nevertheless, there is some negotiation, and I'm not a historian of Africa, but I thought that was an interesting idea to separate those two ideas. Yeah.
Going back to the very beginning of your presentation with the book that kind of was one of the inspirations for the project, Greek.
Christine Hayes, yes.
So ultimately, would you say that Islamic conceptions of divine law somewhere between Greek
Yes.
and biblical?
Exactly. That because it is static, absolutely, and I think the rabbis would also believe monotheism is static, and certain morals are the basics of morality are things you can't really fudge with, and there's certain prayers you have to pray 3 times a day. In Islam, it's 5 times a day. I think they would also hold that it is static, but not in the sense that the Greeks had an unchanged changer. It's not a personal God. And so he's not interested in human flourishing. It's very authoritarian, top-down, and it functions very different, a divine law there. But I did argue that this is the static realm. Yes, right here. This is static. But because it's not static, it doesn't mean arbitrary. I mean, it's supposed to create virtues in, like, if you're praying and fasting, patience and reliance upon God, and letting your spirit rise. Those are all virtues, and removing vices that are. So there's like a rationale. It's not just arbitrary, and I did highlight that in my dissertation. Thank you.
Like a Hegelian higher synthesis kind of thing. It's like both and neither together.
Let's see. Hegelian. I see them as separate. Yeah, I don't see the synthesis happening because how the rules of engagement are totally different from here. Where I got this from is from Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, where he says he's arguing with Karl Popper, and he's saying Aristotle is a good physicist or is a good biologist. We know physics goes from Aristotelian physics to Newtonian, and biology goes from Aristotle to Darwinian. And the thing is, Kuhn is arguing that within the realm within the realm that Aristotle, oh man, my brain is starting to wane. Hold on 1 second. Yes, that Aristotle's working, he's a good philosopher. Popper is saying, look, he's completely wrong. Newtonian physics shows how bad he was. But Popper is looking teleologically back, assuming that it's a natural progression to Newtonian physics. Whereas Kuhn is saying, no, within what counts as good science at that time and the rules of engagement, he was an excellent physicist, right? His arguments worked. He has great arguments. And so each realm is completely different in Kuhn, meaning that Newtonian physics, quantum mechanics are totally different, and they have different, what counts as an argument here doesn't work here, and it doesn't work here, and they're completely separate, but they come together as they're all considered physics. So I was like, wow, that really works well here too. Thanks. Yeah.
I was thinking about, like, you know, one of the core beliefs being donated to charity.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about, like, how, like, the whole point of charity is because some people just don't have as much access to resources.
Yes.
So when it comes to the socioeconomic, shouldn't that like main goal prioritize pretty much either minimizing or eliminating the need for charity?
Yes, but that's why charity is in here, actually. Charity is in here. It's one of the 5 pillars that we covered this year, right? And so that would be a fundamental, that it's not susceptible. Even if there aren't any poor people in society, you still have a duty to help the public sphere in some way, one way or the other. These are more about how people relate to each other one-on-one. As opposed to like a class of poor people. I think that is one of that's dealt with over here. All right.
Thank you.
Oh, one more question, sorry.
Just
Yeah.
a comment. I think you see like the fluctuation too, like kind of what he's talking about in that socioeconomic with like the jurists, because they take it kind of case by case, like whether
Yes.
it's marriage or whether it's with like other spheres of life, and it's like kind of on this precedent, but not like it develops
Yes.
with like earth and like social justice. So yeah.
That's amazing. Like your class that you had with UC Santa Barbara, you got it.
Yeah.
You should write the dissertation. No, just kidding.
Who knows, maybe.
Thanks. I'm good for more questions if you guys want to keep going. Yes.
I guess I've been thinking about how this works, thinking about the experience of African American Muslims coming through that experience.
Yes.
How would you say that this works then, if you're coming from, some coming from Nation of Islam and then moving into Sunni?
Yes. Excellent. So the Ḥanafī school that I was talking about that Ibn ʿＡbidīn subscribes to, it is one of the Sunni schools. So once they make the transition from Nation of Islam, like Warithuddin Muhammad, the son of Elijah, when he became a Sunni, he went to Damascus and he sent all of his students to the same school that I studied at. Yeah. So there's pictures of him with the founder there. And so they were indoctrinated into Sunnism. And so they would also have, again, but like what this would look like in an American context would be totally different. But they would still hold on to the foundational beliefs and practices. But when it comes to economic issues or political issues in America, those would be re-adjudicated. And the thing is, they studied like I studied, so they would be the ones who would have to decide what parts of the tradition that I learned overseas continue here in America, and what parts do we need to let go of and adopt from here in order to move the Muslim community forward and to make sure that Muslims are able to practice and uphold their beliefs in a way that doesn't cause harm to them economically or politically. Thanks. All righty. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. All right.
We still have time for questions if people want to talk privately, because sometimes people don't want to ask questions publicly.
I just want to thank some of the students who came. I didn't force them. I told them there was a DJ here, and unfortunately, yeah. But this is the great thing is, like, I really enjoy sitting in 2 hours of traffic on the way to school every single day, because I get to engage in these great discussions with these students. Yeah. So thank you all for coming and caring. You had great questions. I appreciate it. So I'm gonna.